There are places in America where the law was never written, only carved into the wood of coffins and whispered in backwoods hollers. Tonight, you and I are going to enter one of those places, a forbidden corner of Tennessee where blood feud replaced justice and murder was tradition. But first, hear this, in the final breath of outlaw Henley Sutton. As he lay dying in a pool of his own blood, he whispered a single name, the name of the man who betrayed him. That name was buried with him until now. Hancock County, Tennessee, 1880s. A land where no telegraph line had dared to crawl and no railroad had pierced the mountainous wild. It was called the Devil's Backbone by outsiders, but the locals knew it as troublesome ridge, a natural wall that didn't just divide land, it split lives and destinies. On one side lived the Sutton clan, fierce and solitary, with blood-stained hands. On the other side, the Barnards, a family so ruthless, they were known simply as the bad Barnard Boys. Both families lived by one law: take what is yours and kill any man who disputes it. For decades, their feud simmered under the surface: stolen livestock, threats shouted across valleys, and the occasional body found face down in the dirt. But it wasn't until a single hog crossed that invisible line, when Sutton's pig wandered into Barnard land, that the feud ignited a storm of violence that would leave the mountains soaked in blood. This is not just a story of revenge, a descent into a forgotten world where power was taken at gunpoint and no man could escape the pull of family, pride, and vengeance. The bad Barnard Boys weren't just criminals, they were kings in a kingdom of chaos, men who built an empire on intimidation, moonshine, and unrelenting violence. But what no one knew, what history buried, was the dark pact made between these outlaw kings and the lawmen sworn to stop them. Because in Hancock County, the sheriff didn't fight crime, he was crime. And when Hen Sutton was deputized by the very system meant to destroy him, a chain of betrayal and bloodshed began that would change Appalachia forever. This is the story of how a single murder became a national scandal, and how 5 men shattered the American justice system from the inside out. Henley Sutton wasn't born into peace, he was forged in violence. As a child, he watched his father kill over a bottle of moonshine and then disappear into the hills, leaving Hen and his mother to starve. At 14, Hen strapped a rifle across his back, marched into the wilderness to reclaim his family's last possessions, cow and a colt. Instead, walked straight into a storm of blood. His drunken father refused, fists flew, and Hen beat the old man to the ground. When the coward ran, Hen raised his Winchester and fired 70 yards, 1 shot, and his father lay dead. From that day on, Hen Sutton wasn't a boy, he was an outlaw, and he would never be anything else. By 20, he'd killed more men than he could count, each death a warning to those who dared challenge his rule. But Hen wasn't just a brute, he was brilliant. He understood the power of fear and how to turn bloodshed into control. In Hancock County, where lawmen were few and courage was rarer still, Sutton made them an offer: deputize me, and I'll bring order to these hills. It was no offer, it was an ultimatum. With a colt on his hip and moonshine flowing from his still, Hen became both judge and executioner, his word the only law that mattered. And for a while, the mountains obeyed. But power draws enemies like flies to blood, and on the other side of Troublesome Ridge, the Barnard clan was watching. The Barnards, John Anderson, Eliza, Clinton, and Little John, 5 men bound by blood, armed to the teeth, and seething with hatred for Hen Sutton. Their lands bordered his, their hogs roamed the same chestnut forests, and for years Tension twisted like a coiled serpent between them. One hog, that's all it took. When a Barnard hog wandered onto Sutton land, it never came back. Sutton butchered it, not for hunger, but as a message. The Barnard Boys read it loud and clear, and their response was savage. They slaughtered Sutton's hogs, over 30 of them, and left the carcasses to rot as a declaration of war. Hen rode out, found the Barnard brothers, and beat them within an inch of their lives, promising next time he wouldn't be so merciful. The feud was no longer a simmer, it was a blaze, and in these mountains, fire always ends in death. But neither side knew that the real war had only just begun. Word of the Sutton-Barnard clash spread like wildfire through the mountain passes and moonshine, trails of East Tennessee. At the grist mills and church steps, whispers grew louder. Men spoke in hushed tones of what would come next. Because everyone knew that once blood was drawn in these hills, there was no peace, only retribution. And Hen Sutton, battered pride, burning in his gut, was not a man to forgive, but neither were the Barnards. The 5 brothers, humiliated and broken-boned after Sutton's brutal assault, didn't just seek revenge, they plotted annihilation. They watched, waited, learned his patterns. Sutton was bold, but predictable. His days were divided between his fortified cabin and his distillery hidden deep in the hollows, where the sweetest water ran and the law dared not tread. Attacking him at either stronghold was suicide. The Barnards knew their only chance was to strike while Sutton moved when he was alone, vulnerable, between his fortress of wood and his empire of liquor. January 12, 1889, bitter cold, snow clinging to the ridges like ash from an old fire. The Barnard Boys took position near a fallen tree on the narrow road at the base of Troublesome Ridge, a perfect place for an ambush. They didn't speak, didn't blink, they waited. Sunset dipped the sky blood red, and in the distance came the sound hoofbeats, steady, unhurried. Sutton approached, rifle slung low, eyes sharp, unaware he was riding into his own execution. At 100 yards, Big John Barnard raised his Winchester, breathed in, and pulled the trigger. The crack shattered the silence, and instantly 4 more rifles exploded, filling the air with smoke and lead. When the haze lifted, Hen Sutton lay dead, a bullet through his heart, his lifeless eyes staring at the sky he would never see again. But the Barnards weren't finished. They approached and riddled the corpse with more bullets, his legs, shoulders, skull, turning the feared outlaw into a shattered ruin. It was over, or so they believed. Unseen, just beyond the ridge, a lone rider had watched it all. He turned his horse and rode hard to Sneedville, carrying not just news of the ambush, but the spark that would ignite a firestorm in the American justice system. The bad Barnard Boys had no idea. They hadn't just killed a man, they had murdered a symbol of unchecked power, and in doing so, they awakened forces far more dangerous than Hen Sutton ever was. By sunrise, Sneedville buzzed like a hornet's nest, struck by a stick of dynamite. The lone witness who had seen the ambush arrived breathless, spilling every detail of Sutton's execution at the hands of the Barnard clan. Within hours, a posse of lawmen and vigilantes rode hard through the frozen countryside to the Barnard homestead. They found Big John outside, casually whittling a stick, his boots soaked in blood-stained mud. When asked if he'd killed Hen Sutton, he didn't flinch. "Sure did," he said, "and I'd do it again." In his mind, the tyrant was dead, and the hills could finally breathe. But John had misjudged something crucial. Sutton's connections didn't die with him. In life, Sutton had been feared. In death, He became a martyr for the law, a symbol of order, however twisted. The bad Barnard Boys were promptly arrested, shackled, and hauled to Knox County Jail. But this wasn't just another backwoods murder case. This would become the first time in American history that 5 men faced the gallows for the killing of a single man. The media smelled blood. Newspapers from Nashville to New York plastered the story. 5 to hang in Tennessee. The Barnard butchers faced justice. The nation was captivated. In cities, readers saw the Barnards as relics of a dying, lawless age. But in the shadowed valleys of Appalachia, opinions were divided. Many believed the Barnards had done what lawmen couldn't. They killed the devil himself. Yet justice was relentless. For 9 long months, the brothers rotted in jail, awaiting trial. October 1889 arrived, and with it came packed courtrooms, armed guards, and reporters clawing for headlines. The trial unfolded like a dark opera, brutal testimony, blood-stained evidence, and the smirking Barnards unrepentant in the dock. When the jury returned, silence gripped the room like a noose. Guilty, they declared. All 5, sentenced to death by hanging. Not a single Barnard flinched. They stared ahead, stone-eyed, as if the gallows were just another mountain to climb. Appeals flew to the Tennessee Supreme Court and failed. The execution date was set 2 days before Christmas. The hills trembled with the news. But behind closed doors, power shifted. Political forces, hidden hands, began to move. And what happened next would not only rewrite justice, it would reveal how deeply the roots of corruption had coiled into the heart of America's legal system. The noose was ready, but someone had other plans. December 23, 1889. The coldest winter in decades gripped Tennessee like a clenched fist, and in the stone walls of Knox County Jail, the Barnard brothers awaited death. The gallows had been built, ropes measured and tested, the final meal prepared. Outside, crowds gathered, some in support, many to witness what they believed would be the end of a violent era. But in the last hour before the execution, a messenger arrived, cloak soaked with snow, eyes burning with urgency. In his gloved hand was a letter from Governor Robert Love Taylor, official pardon for the Barnard cousins, Clinton and Little John, and a commuted sentence of 5 to 10 years for the remaining 3 brothers. The reason? Mercy, the governor claimed. But behind that word was something darker, something unsaid. The crowd erupted in confusion and rage. Across the nation, headlines exploded. Justice denied. Governor defies law and people. Corruption in Tennessee. Editorials called for Taylor's impeachment, accusing him of bending to the will of local power brokers, of selling justice for political favor. But in the hills, men nodded in approval. In their eyes, the governor had done right by mountain folk. Yet what happened next shattered all illusions of mercy. Just 5 days into their reduced sentence, Governor Taylor issued full, unconditional pardons for all 5 Barnards. No explanation, no remorse. The brothers walked free, guns on their hips, smiles on their faces. Justice hadn't just failed, had been bought, twisted, and thrown to the ground. The implications were terrifying. If men like the Barnards could kill openly, admit it proudly, and walk away untouched, what did law mean? Who controlled the system, and how deep did the corruption go? The message was clear: power didn't belong to courts or juries. It belonged to those willing to use fear as currency and bullets as signatures. The Barnards returned to not as reformed men, but as conquerors. They didn't seek peace, they wanted to erase every trace of the Sutton name. With a posse behind them, they laid siege to the town, hunting Hen, Sutton's father-in-law and son. The old man vanished into hiding. The town trembled, paralyzed, and in the echo of gunfire and shattered windows, a single truth emerged. This was not over. Justice had lost its teeth. The hills belonged to the bad men now, and the blood had only begun to flow. The siege of Sneedville was not a drunken rampage. It was calculated an act of domination meant to erase the Sutton legacy and burn fear into the hearts of every man who dared defy the Barnard name. For days, the bad Barnard Boys prowled the town, rifles slung, eyes hunting. The father-in-law of Hen Sutton, the last elder of the Sutton clan, had vanished like smoke, hidden by those too terrified to speak his name. But the true target, the one who carried the blood of Hen Sutton, was his son. A young man raised in the shadow of violence, hardened by loss, and taught from birth that mercy was weakness and hesitation was death. While the town cowered, the son waited. He didn't run, he didn't beg, he prepared. And when Sunday came, he did the unthinkable. He walked straight into a rural Baptist church, sat in the front pew, and waited. News traveled fast in the hollers. By the time the sermon began, the Barnard brothers had taken their places in the back, rifles beneath coats, pistols at the ready. The preacher trembled through his sermon, sweat pouring down his face, eyes darting to the armed men scattered. Throughout his congregation, he knew what was coming. Everyone did, but no one dared speak. When the final amen echoed through the sanctuary, chaos lurked beneath the silence. Churchgoers bolted for the doors, panic erupting. But it was too late. The Barnards blocked every exit. There was no escape, no negotiation. The young Sutton stood calm, eyes locked on Big John Barnard, the man who led the ambush that killed his father. In that moment, time cracked open. Without a word, Sutton drew his Colt and fired 3 shots, fast and precise. Each bullet tore into Big John's back, dropping him to the floor. Gunfire erupted, echoing like thunder in the wooden sanctuary. Sutton was hit, once, twice, blood pouring from his wounds, but he kept firing. The last bullet he ever fired pierced Big John's heart just as the outlaw raised his pistol to finish Sutton. Both men collapsed, lifeless, tangled in blood and death. The feud had claimed its heirs, yet in death, they weren't mourned, they were legend. And the violence they unleashed didn't end in that church. It would echo for decades, through every darkened hollow and forgotten ridge. Because in Hancock County, blood was not washed away, was inherited. The church floor was soaked in blood, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder and fear. Outside the hills of Hancock County stood silent, but within those walls, a reckoning had unfolded. 2 menhirs of bloodlines forged in violently dead, locked in the brutal embrace of death. But the feud did not die with them. It metastasized, growing like a shadow that stretched across generations. In the days that followed, the town of Sneedville buried the bodies quietly. There were no grand funerals, no mourning processions. Just whispered prayers and grave markers placed in soil already heavy with the dead. But fear hung like fog over the hills. Men locked their doors at sundown. Families vanished into the deeper hollows, hiding from a vengeance no law could stop. You see, this wasn't just a personal feud, it was a war between ideologies. On one side, men like Hen Sutton who believed in control through dominance, who used law as a weapon to rule. On the other, men like the Barnards who rejected all authority except the barrel of a rifle. What began as a dispute over hogs had become a symbol of Appalachian lawlessness, a savage testament to what happens when power is unchecked and violence is culture. The state tried to restore order, but its reach couldn't penetrate the twisted back roads and dense forests of Hancock County. Posses sent to disarm the Barnards' allies found only empty cabins and vanished trails. Informants disappeared. Witnesses refused to speak. Fear was the only law that remained. Over the next 20 years, men continued to die cousins' uncles, even in lozenge killing justified by some ancient insult or imagined slight. But the truth was simpler. The bloodshed wasn't about property or pride. It was about legacy. In these mountains, to show weakness was to invite death, and to live meant carrying the violence of your forefathers like a birthright. Even today, the land remembers. On Google Maps, you can trace the ghost's Barnard Hollow Road, troublesome ridge-silent markers of a forgotten war. Most passers-by have no idea what happened there, but the earth remembers the blood, the trees remember the gunfire, and the men who live in those hills still walk armed not for fear of wild beasts, but because old feuds never die, they wait. And in the right moment, they rise again. History buried the Sutton-Barnard feud beneath layers of dust and silence. But beneath that silence lies a dangerous truth, one that speaks not just of violence, but of manipulation, of power exercised. In the shadows, the story didn't end in gunfights and graves. It evolved. It morphed into something larger, darker, because in the aftermath of the feud, something changed in Hancock County. The government didn't just forget the bloodshed, used it. Politicians and lawmen began exploiting the chaos, consolidating power, seizing land, and rewriting the narrative. The Barnards were painted as wild beasts, Sutton as a fallen martyr of order, and the people caught in the middle became pawns. The moonshine trade, once an outlaw's game, was taken over by state-sanctioned interests. Roads were built, not for the people, but for control. And the land, the very soil where men had bled for sovereignty, was surveyed, divided, and taxed into submission. What the gun couldn't conquer, bureaucracy did. And behind every new law, every new boundary, stood men who profited from the violence that had gripped Appalachia. The feud was used to justify expansion, to silence dissent, to erase the independence of mountain folk who once lived by their own code. It was never about justice, it was about absorption, psychological warfare disguised as progress. In the name of law and order, the hills were tamed, but at what cost? Families forced from their land, traditions outlawed, ancestral ways dismantled. The government used the fear birthed by Sutton and Barnard to mold a new kind of Appalachian, man-obedient, dependent, and stripped of the feral freedom his ancestors once lived and died for. This is the hidden legacy of the feud. Not just blood on the ground, but a blueprint, how to break a people. First through chaos, then through control. A cycle repeated across history. And the deeper you dig, the more you see it how darkness, cloaked in law, reshapes entire generations. This is no longer just a story of two men. It is the story of how power rewrites truth. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That's why most will never speak of what really happened in Hancock County, because to know is to awaken. And when a man awakens, he becomes dangerous. The hills remember. And so should you. In the years that followed, the narrative of the Sutton-Barnard feud became a ghost, warped, sanitized, and weaponized. Textbooks ignored it. Official records distorted it. But in the oral histories of old mountain families, the truth simmered like a coiled serpent. They spoke of men who didn't just kill for pride, but men who were used as tools, instruments of a larger force. You see, the bloodshed served more than personal vendettas, fed the appetites of hidden players. Outside tycoons, federal agents, and industrialists watched Hancock County with greedy eyes. The violence had made the land cheap, the people pliable, and in the chaos, they made their move. Mountains once ruled by clans were bought and sold to coal barons and timber magnates. The hills bled not just men but wealth, stolen beneath the smokescreen of lawlessness. And while the Barnards and Suttons destroyed each other, these men, nameless, faceless, planted the seeds of institutional control. The railroads finally came, not as lifelines, but as chains. Telegraph lines didn't bring communication, they brought surveillance. And men, once free in the wild, now worked for pennies in mines that poisoned their lungs and broke their backs. That was the real legacy of the feud. It wasn't about hogs or moonshine. It was about transformation, turning sovereign men into subjects. But the story goes deeper still. There are whispers, documents, long buried, letters never published suggesting that the pardons issued by Governor Taylor weren't acts of mercy at all. They were bargains. The Barnards, in exchange for freedom, agreed to quiet their feud, to yield their influence, to allow the silent takeover of their ancestral lands. The governor's pardon was not a gift, it was a contract, one that handed over the future of Hancock County to unseen masters. And what became of the Barnards? Broken, scattered. Some turned to drink, others vanished into obscurity. The proud clan that once defied the law became relics, reminders of a past too dangerous to remember. The people who remained lived under the shadow of what was lost. Their autonomy, their fire, snuffed out by manipulation that wore the mask of progress. That's how systems work. They don't need your permission, just your silence. And the silence after the Sutton-Barnard feud wasn't peace. It was surrender. The hills had been conquered, not by guns, but by hidden hands. By the turn of the 20th century, the hills of East Tennessee bore no resemblance to the wild land once ruled by men like Hen Sutton and Big John Barnard. But beneath the surface, a different kind of war was being waged. The same families who once fought with rifles now faced a new enemy: debt, dependence, and institutional control. The land, once freely hunted, farmed, and fought over, now carried titles, deeds, and taxes. Courts far removed from Hancock County decided its fate, and men who could once settle disputes with a glance or a gun were now dragged into legal battles they didn't understand. Judged by men in suits who had never set foot on Troublesome Ridge, but the ghost of the feud still haunted the people. You could see it in the eyes of old-timers who refused to speak Sutton's or Barnard's name aloud. You could hear it in the songs in ancient ballads, sung in minor keys, about justice, betrayal, and the price of freedom. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. Because some claimed that what happened in Hancock County wasn't just corruption, it was experimentation. That the feud had been observed, studied, and used as a test. How do you control a lawless land? First, you let it burn. Then you arrive with promises of order. But order, in this case, meant submission. Schools were built, but the curriculum taught obedience, not truth. Churches flourished, but their sermons emphasized meekness, not resistance. And slowly, generation by generation, the fierce independence of the Appalachian people was chiseled away. Not through war, but through subtle domination, psychological, spiritual, cultural. The descendants of the Suttons and Barnards grew up under this shadow, many unaware of the legacy buried in their blood. But a few remembered. A few dug into old records, family journals, hidden letters, and what they found was chilling. Evidence that federal marshals had known about the feud long before it exploded had chosen not to intervene. That Hen Sutton's appointment as a U.S. deputy marshal was not to enforce law, but to destabilize the region. That the violence was not accidental, but engineered, a crucible of blood to forge compliance. You weren't meant to know this, and that's exactly why you must. Because if it happened here, it can happen again. Hidden hands shaping history not for justice, but for control. The true war was never between Sutton and Barnard. It was between freedom and subjugation, and the hills still carry the scars. There's an old saying in those mountains: the land remembers what the people forget. And while time erases names from tombstones, it cannot erase the blood soaked into the soil of Hancock County. After the final gunshots faded from the Barnard-Sutton feud, the true erasure began not just of lives, but of memory. Courthouse records mysteriously disappeared. Newspaper archives from Sneedville, covering the years 1887 to 1895. Witness statements lost. Court transcripts missing. What little documentation remained painted a narrow picture. Outlaws fighting over livestock. Lawmen too weak to intervene, and a governor offering pardons out of mercy. But those who still lived in the hollows whispered a different story, one that couldn't be written down for fear of who might be watching. The real power wasn't in who held the gun, but who controlled the narrative, and some force wanted that narrative buried. But why? What threat did this feud pose to the world beyond Hancock County? The answer lies in what the feud revealed. In a time before mass surveillance, before centralized law, these men lived outside the system. They governed themselves. They built their homes, grew their food, distilled their own spirits, and answered to no one. To outsiders, this was chaos. To those in control, it was dangerous. The feud gave those in power the perfect excuse to dismantle this autonomy. The violence was shocking, yes, but it was also useful. It created fear, and fear breeds submission. Under the guise of protecting the people, new laws were passed, laws that required permits for moonshining, hunting, land use. Laws that taxed, restricted, and licensed every act of survival that once required no permission. And the people, weary from bloodshed and numbed by fear, accepted it. This was no accident. It was a psychological operation, decades before such terms even existed. Control, not through force, but through trauma. You traumatize a community, and they will beg for the chains. The story of the bad Barnard Boys wasn't preserved because it was inconvenient. It was silenced because it was a myth. How freedom dies, not in war, but in peace forged by manipulation. Those 5 men, those forgotten gunmen of Troublesome Ridge, weren't just outlaws. They were the last stand against a system that sought to own not just land, but souls. And when they fell, the door was opened for what came next. A darker age, hidden behind the mask of order. The question is how much of our history was shaped the same way, and how much of it is still being shaped right now. What if I told you that the Sutton-Barnard feud was just the surface? A smokescreen, a distraction. That behind the bloodshed was something more, insidiouser, calculated transformation, not just of land, but of the human spirit. The people of Hancock County were once called unruly, untamable, dangerously independent, and to those in power, that was unacceptable. You see, these hills weren't just rich in timber and cold, they were rich in human autonomy, a kind of wild sovereignty that could not be bought or legislated. It had to be broken, and the feud became the hammer. In the years that followed, outsiders began arriving in droves: surveyors, land agents, tax collectors, missionaries. They came not to help, but to redefine. Schools were built where children were taught to reject their own dialects, their own customs. Preachers warned against the sins of rebellion, shaping minds to bow before authority. The once proud mountain men were recast as backward, ignorant, in need of saving. The very identity of Appalachia was rewritten from warrior to subject. And at the heart of this transformation lay the Sutton Barnard feuder, perfect, violent myth to justify intervention. And here's the chilling part: it worked. Within a generation, the resistance was gone. The outlaw clans had either been wiped out, imprisoned, or reduced to legend. The railroads came, but not for the people, for their resources. Coal mining companies seized the hills. Families that had lived on the land for centuries were evicted with ink and paper, not bullets. The war had shifted from guns to contracts, from physical violence to institutional theft. And the trauma of the feud, it lingered, passed down in hushed stories, in restless sleep, in the hollow gaze of men who remembered freedom but could no longer grasp it. This is the hidden mechanism of control. Psychological erosion. You make men fear themselves, distrust their neighbors, long for peace at any cost. And in that desperation, they surrender not just land, but identity. The story of the Barnard Boys wasn't just a race to hide the violence, it was a race to hide the victory, not of law over chaos, but of domination over independence. And now, ask yourself how many other feuds, wars, and crises were orchestrated the same way. How many moments of history were not spontaneous, but staged to change what it means to be free. This is not just a story, it's a warning, a blueprint, and the script is still being written. As the smoke cleared from the final shots fired on Troublesome Ridge, a silence fell not. A peaceful silence, but the heavy stillness of submission. The Barnard Boys, once feared, were no longer outlaws, but relics used, discarded, forgotten. And Hen Sutton, his name etched into legend, but twisted to serve a new agenda. He was no longer the tyrant moonshiner, no longer the iron-fisted warlord of Hancock County. In the retelling, he became a cautionary tale man who resisted progress, who paid the price for standing in the way of civilization. The truth was scrubbed clean, and the lies were repeated until they became accepted history. But the people closest to the land never forgot. They spoke of a different Sutton, a man who saw the threat before others did. A man who understood that the railroad wasn't bringing prosperity, was bringing chains. Sutton didn't fear the law because he was a criminal. He feared it because he knew who controlled it, and the Barnards. They weren't heroes, but they weren't monsters either. They were pawns, provoked, manipulated, used to spark the very chaos that gave the authorities justification to clamp down on Hancock County like never before. The feud, from beginning to end, was engineered. Not every bullet, not every blow, but the conditions, the pressure, the provocations, they were laid carefully, step by step. And the men caught in the middle were too proud to too entrenched in old codes of honor to see the trap until it was too late. What followed was predictable. Land seizures masked as legal proceedings. Moonshine stills destroyed under federal orders. Families divided, broken, or vanished. And all the while, those in power grew fat on the spoils and touched by the violence they had incited. Invisible behind curtains of law and order, this wasn't just control, it was conquest. A silent war on memory, on tradition, on resistance. Itself, and today. The story lives in fragments, cracked tombstones, rusted rifles, faded photographs. But the pattern endures. Manufactured conflict, justified intervention, and in the aftermath, the quiet erasure of what once was. If you think this is only about Hancock County, you're wrong. This was a microcosm, a testing ground, and it worked. The question is, where is it being done now? What conflict, what crisis is being used to shift power from the people to the few? Watch closely, because the past doesn't die. It repeats, always. There's something you need to understand. This story wasn't just buried. It was buried alive. Every detail of the Sutton-Barnard feud that survived did so because someone risked everything to remember. A worn journal hidden beneath floorboards, a blood-stained rifle passed down like a relic, a grandmother's whispered tale by firelight. These fragments, scattered and fragile, form the true history, one that never made it into official records or government archives. Because if this truth was fully known, it would expose a playbook centuries in the making, divide the people, provoke violence, install control. This wasn't unique to Appalachia, it was perfected there. Hancock County was the test case, the prototype, and once the pattern proved successful, it was replicated again and again. From the coal wars of West Virginia to the Indian wars of the Great Plains, the formula remained the same. Create instability, offer salvation, and rewire the soul of a people. What the Barnards and Suttons didn't know was that their fates were sealed the moment outsiders labeled them problematic. Once that label was attached, their destiny was no longer their own. And that is the real horror. Just that they died, but that their lives were used to justify a system of control that still exists today. Think about it. How many times have we been shown a conflict, only to be told the solution requires surrendering freedoms? How many times have our fears been weaponized to make us beg for safety, even if it means submitting to forces we don't understand? This is the dark alchemy of power, and it's been refined through blood, through fire, through stories like this one. The Barnard Boys, in the end, were not free men. They were symbols of a freedom that had to be destroyed to ensure obedience. And Hen Sutton, he became a myth because myths are easier to control than men, easier to twist, to sanitize, to erase. But now you know. This knowledge isn't safe. It demands something from you. And if you've made it this far, you're no longer just a viewer, you're part of the chain of memory that refuses to be broken. Type "I awaken to the forbidden past" twice in the comments to lock it in, to mark yourself as one who sees beyond the veil, because once you hear this truth, you can't unhear it. You can only choose what to do with it. The story is not over, not here, not now. Let's go deeper, because what happened after the Barnard Boys walked free reveals the darkest layer of all. 5 days, that's all they spent behind bars, before Governor Robert Love Taylor erased their sentences with a stroke of a pen. But don't be fooled, this wasn't mercy, it was strategy. You see, power rarely reveals itself in the thunder of courtrooms or the crack of gunfire. Real power whispers in back rooms, hidden deals, and sealed letters. The governor's pardon wasn't an act of kindness. It was a transaction. Sources long suppressed, but traced through family records, and a single, surviving letter suggest that Taylor was under immense pressure from industrial investors eyeing Hancock County's untouched wealth, coal, timber, mineral. resources lying beneath the very hills that the Barnards and Suttons called home. But conflict threatened those plans. Investors don't move into war zones. They need peace, even if that peace is bought in blood. The pardon wasn't about justice. It was about clearing the board, removing the last violent players so the land could be carved, sold, and mined. And here's where it gets colder. After the Barnards returned home, a new presence arrived in Hancock County corporate surveyors, federal agents, and private security forces operating not under the law but under contracts. The people, broken by the feud, scattered. Some sold their land for pennies, others were forced out through legal manipulations. It was a quiet conquest. No more feuds, no more bloodsheds, just the cold grind of institutions swallowing what free men once bled for. And the Barnards, their fate was sealed, too. Big John lay dead. His brothers and cousins, now outlaws in a system that no longer needed them, were hunted down one by one, accused of new crimes, jailed, or disappeared. The same governor who pardoned them ensured they'd never rise again. That's how power moves. It lifts you up, only to drop you when the time is right. Their story wasn't just a raise. Dead was repurposed, weaponized, used to teach future generations not to resist, not to fight, to obey. And this is the forgotten war. Not just for land, but for the soul of a people, for memory itself. And if you think this is ancient history, think again. This pattern lives, breathes, evolves. It waits, and it watches. Now imagine standing on Barnard Hollow Road today, quiet, unassuming, a ribbon of dirt cutting through dense Appalachian woods. No gunfire, no screams, just wind whispering through the trees, carrying the echoes of a war no history book dares recount. Beneath your feet lies the blood of men who defied a system, some for pride, some for power, some just to survive. But the land remembers, and in this silence, you can almost hear them, the Barnards, the Suttons, the voices of a past that was never laid to rest, only buried. What haunts this story is not just the violence, but the aftermath, the deliberate cleansing of memory. You see, the power structure didn't just want the land or the resources, it wanted control over time itself. By erasing the narrative, they erased resistance. Without a story, a people cannot fight back. Without a history, they cannot claim injustice, and so they become shadows, forgotten, voiceless, invisible. This is the final stage of conquest, not the taking of bodies or land, but of identity, of legacy, and the tool they used. You're holding it right now. The story, or rather, the manipulated version of it. The Sutton-Barnard feud was retold in newspapers far from Hancock County as a savage affair among backward mountain men, sensationalized, ridiculed, stripped of its truth. These weren't just outlaws, they were symbols of an autonomous people, and their erasure wasn't random, it was engineered. Every lie printed, every fact omitted, every photograph that never saw the light of day was all part of a campaign to reshape the consciousness of a region, to make men forget they were once free, to make future generations ashamed of their roots. And it worked. For over a century, no one asked about the Barnard Boys. No one dared. But now the silence is broken. You've heard their story, the real story, and with that knowledge comes a burden. Because now you know how power operates, not just through violence, but through narrative control. And you have to ask, what other truths have been buried? What parts of your own history have been rewritten, distorted, or stolen? This is no longer about Hancock County. It's about every place where the past has been silenced, where the truth is a threat, and where remembering is an act of rebellion. You stand at that crossroads now. The question is, will you remember, or will you forget? Let me tell you what happened to those who dared to remember. In the decades following the feud, a few elders keepers of oral history attempted to pass down the truth. They spoke in low tones, warning young men not to trust the written word. Alone, not to trust the polished voices from far-off cities who came with promises of progress. These old men remembered. They had seen the land taken, the families shattered, the mountains carved open for coal, and the rivers poisoned by industry. And they had seen the Barnard Hollow transformed from a battleground of blood and honor to a scarred wasteland patrolled by company men with rifles and ledgers. Those who remembered tried to resist, but this time, not with guns, with stories, in churches, in barns, by candlelight. They told the tale of Hen Sutton not as a villain, but as a sentinel who saw the future for what it was, domination disguised as civilization. They told of the Barnard Boys, not as brutes, but as brothers who were provoked, manipulated, and ultimately discarded. And they warned that the same fate would befall any man who stood in the way of what they called the Great Forgetting. But memory, when it lives only in whispers, is a fragile thing. Over time, those old men died. Their stories were called superstition, myth, paranoia. The younger generation, lured by paychecks from the coal companies, tempted by the trappings of modernity, let the stories fade. And when the last man who had seen the feud with his own eyes passed into the grave, the silence was complete. The records sanitized, the land owned by outsiders, the people dispossessed of their history. This is how erasure happens, not in a single moment, but in slow, calculated erosion. Truth becomes legend, legend becomes rumor, rumor becomes silence, and silence becomes obedience. But even in silence, the land remembers. Strange occurrences lingered in Barnard Hollow. Unexplained fires, shadows moving along troublesome ridge at dusk, hunters who returned pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they saw, because some say the souls of the feud are not at rest, that until their story is fully known, until the truth is spoken aloud, they will not sleep. And now you've heard that truth. The question is, what will you do with it? Now listen carefully, because this is where the story crosses the threshold. From forgotten history into something far darker. The legend of the Barnard Hollow curse began not long after the last Barnard boy disappeared without a trace. Locals whispered that the land itself had turned against them. Livestock vanished. Children fell ill. Crops rotted in the ground. At first, they blamed bad luck, then bad weather. But soon they realized this was something else, something watching, something ancient. You see, Troublesome Ridge wasn't just a battlefield. Long before the Suttons, before the Barnards, the native peoples of the region Cherokee and Shawnees spoke of that mountain as a sacred boundary, a place where the world of the living and the realm of the dead were thinly separated. They called it a crossing place, where spirits of the dishonored could not rest, where violence tainted the earth itself. And when the feud erupted in that very spot, the old curse was awakened. Elders recalled strange dreams, visions of blood-soaked men wandering the forest. They said the spirits of the dead Suttons and Barnards had become bound to the ridge, locked in a never-ending war, seeking justice that history had denied them. Those who trespassed, especially outsiders, reported hearing gunshots at night, the sound of hooves on stone, and voices calling out in agony. Some say you can still see them, the ghosts of Hen, Sutton, and Big John Barnard, pacing the mountain, doomed to confront each other over and over, unable to break free. But here's the part the newspapers never mentioned. After the land was sold off, a private mining company attempted to strip Troublesome Ridge for coal. Their first crew vanished. Search parties found their gear, tools scattered, and symbols carved into the tree symbols no one recognized. The company pulled out. Quietly. To this day, no corporation has ever successfully mined Troublesome Ridge. The mountain refuses. The land keeps its secrets. And perhaps that's the justice no court could give the earth itself rising to protect the truth. Some say the Barnards and Suttons were cursed, but others believe they became the curse, a warning to any power that seeks to erase history, to exploit the dead for profit. You don't have to believe it, but if you ever stand in Barnard Hollow and you feel the wind shift and the air grow still, you'll understand. This is not just a story, it's a haunting, a reckoning, and it's far from over. Here's where it all begins to circle back. Because what if I told you that the curse of Troublesome Ridge wasn't an accident of violence, but a design? Not just a feud born of pride, but a cycle engineered to never end. The deeper you look into this case, the more you uncover a chilling pattern on ancient formula: provoke, divide, escalate, destroy, then silence. It didn't start with Sutton and the Barnards. Long before them, the land was soaked in similar blood. In the 1700s, early settlers reported entire families vanishing along that same ridge. The cause? Labeled Indian raids by colonial authorities. But native accounts told a different story. They spoke of shadowy figures, not men, stalking the woods and turning neighbor against neighbor. Colonial governors used the fear to justify seizing land, deploying troops, and cementing control over remote populations. Sound familiar? Fast forward to 1888, the same playbook. The feud didn't just erupt, it was encouraged. Remember those federal agents, the moonshine raids, the governor's sudden interest in law and order? What if those weren't responses to violence but triggers? Stir the pot, arm both sides, let them tear each other apart. And while they do, step in as savior, claiming the land and rewriting the story. This is the darkest truth. The feud was not just a tragedy, it was a tool, and the curse. That's just what the survivors called it when they saw the aftermath, but couldn't explain the cause. This is psychological control at its purest. A mechanism to fracture communities, instill fear, and break resistance before it forms. And it works because it hides behind emotion, honor, revenge. But the ones who lit the fuse never paid the price. They walked free. They grew rich. They wrote the history books. And that's why this story matters. Not because it's unique, but because it reveals the template. A blueprint used again and again in Appalachia, in the South, across America, wherever people stand in the way of power. It starts with a feud, a crime, a killing. It ends with land lost, truth buried, and the people left in ruins. But now, the pattern is exposed, and when you see it, you cannot unsee it. You begin to question every conflict, every so-called accident of history. You begin to awaken, and that's exactly what they fear. They fear your awakening because once a man sees the pattern, he becomes ungovernable, not in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of those who truly hold power. And now, you stand at the edge of that awakening. Let's step further into the darkness, Because the story of the Barnard-Sutton feud doesn't just end with their deaths or with the curse. There was one last chapter, kept in shadow, whispered, only among the oldest families of Hancock County. After the church bloodbath, with Hen Sutton's son and Big John both dead, the remaining Barnard cousins vanished into the mountains. But they didn't disappear. They regrouped, forming a covert militia of outlaws known as the Hollow Men. For years, they waged a quiet war not against other families, but against the new powers rising in Hancock County. Corporate enforcers, sent to protect the mining interests, were found dead, ambushed on the same roads Sutton once patrolled. Federal agents investigating moonshine disappeared without trace, and always, carved into trees near the sites, a single mark, a hollowed-out circle, symbol of the Hollow Men. Lawmen stopped entering the region. The government labeled it a no-go zone, and for a brief moment, the people of the mountains reclaimed their autonomy. But power does not forgive rebellion. By 1901, the federal government dispatched a covert force of Pinkerton agents, mercenaries in all but name. Their orders were simple: end the Hollow Men. What followed was a purge so brutal it was never documented, only pieced together through letters, missing persons records, and hidden graves found deep in the forest. Within months, the Hollow Men were no more, and with them, the last remnant of resistance in Hancock County was extinguished. The mining began. The timber fell, and the mountains bled silently. But here's the twist: the mark of the Hollow Men didn't vanish. In 1932, during a union strike against the coal companies, that same hollow circle appeared again, this time carved into the company's headquarters. No one claimed responsibility. The message was clear. History was not dead. The spirit of defiance lived on, and it still does. Because every time one man remembers, one man questions the story, one man speaks the truth, they fear it, and they should. Because memory is power, and now it's yours. They fear your awakening, because once a man sees the pattern, he becomes ungovernable, not in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of those who truly hold power. And now, you stand at the edge of that awakening. Let's step further into the darkness, because the story of the Barnard-Sutton feud doesn't just end with their deaths or with the curse. There was one last chapter, kept in shadow, whispered only among the oldest families of Hancock County. After the church bloodbath, with Hen Sutton's son and Big John both dead, the remaining Barnard cousins vanished into the mountains. But they didn't disappear. They regrouped, forming a covert militia of outlaws known as the Hollow Men. For years, they waged a quiet war not against other families, but against the new powers rising in Hancock County. Corporate enforcers sent to protect the mining interests were found dead, ambushed on the same roads Sutton once patrolled. Federal agents investigating moonshine disappeared without trace, and always, carved into trees near the sites, a single mark, a hollowed-out circle, symbol of the Hollow Men. Lawmen stopped entering the region. The government labeled it a no-go zone, and for a brief moment, the people of the mountains reclaimed their autonomy. But power does not forgive rebellion. By 1901, the federal government dispatched a covert force of Pinkerton agents in all but name. Their orders were simple: end the Hollow Men. What followed was a purge so brutal it was never documented, only pieced together through letters, missing persons records, and hidden graves found deep in the forest. Within months, the Hollow Men were no more, and with them, the last remnant of resistance in Hancock County was extinguished. The mining began, the timber fell, and the mountains bled silently. But here's the twist, the mark of the hollow. Men didn't vanish. In 1932, during a union strike against the coal companies, that same hollow circle appeared again, this time carved into the company's headquarters. No one claimed responsibility. The message was clear. History was not dead. The spirit of defiance lived on, and it still does. Because every time one man remembers, one man questions the story, one man speaks the truth, they fear it, and they should. Because memory is power. And now it's yours. Deeper into the dark means facing the ultimate. Revelation, the war for Hancock County was never about moonshine, property, or even blood feuds. It was about control. But not just control of land, control of memory, identity, and destiny. Let's look at the aftermath. After the Barnard-Sutton feud ended and the Hollow men were extinguished, something eerie happened in the region. The people didn't just lose their land, they lost themselves. Federal education programs swept through Appalachia, claiming to civilize the backward folk. But those schools didn't teach reading and writing. They taught submission. Generations of boys were told their ancestors were criminals, that the mountains were shameful, that to be Appalachian was to be inferior. Sound familiar? This is cultural erased at its progress, and the ones orchestrating it, not local officials, but institutions far removed from the mountain's banks, railroads, political elitesmen who never set foot in Hancock County, but dictated its future. What they feared wasn't guns or rebellion, was heritage. The kind of identity that cannot be bought, sold, or subdued. So they rewrote the story. The Barnards became hillbilly thugs, Sutton, a savage, the Hollow, men, myth, and in their place, a new narrative. Compliance equals survival. Assimilation equals safety. And over time, the people believed it. But not everyone forgot. Scattered across the region, descendants of the feud kept artifacts, rifles, coded maps, hidden in barns, under floorboards, buried in the woods. And occasionally, someone would stumble upon them and remember. One man, a descendant of Hen Sutton, uncovered a trunk in 1971 inside, a journal, Sutton's journal. And in it, he described the real reason he fortified his land, he claimed. Men in black coats came not to arrest him, but to offer him a deal, sell his land to a northern railroad or face ruin. Sutton refused, and days later the feud began. Manufactured, engineered, that journal vanished from public record. The man who found it died in a fire ruled accidental, and once again silence returned. But these fragments still exist, buried, in time, waiting to be found. And when enough are uncovered, the full truth will shatter everything we were taught to believe about this land, this history, and ourselves. You feel it now, don't you? The pull, the knowing. We are not at the end, we are at the beginning. The real war has always been about truth. The war for truth is the most dangerous war of all, because it requires no battlefield, no rifles, no feuding families. Just one man who dares to remember. One man who refuses to accept the version of history sold to him by the powerful. And now you understand why stories like the Barnard-Sutton feud are buried beneath layers of ridicule and dismissal. They don't want you to ask why. They don't want you to see the parallels between those mountains and your own life. But look closer, and the strategy repeats: divide people by class, race, family, and then label their defiance as criminal, their resistance as savage. Then comes the reform. the progress, the institutions that arrive not to serve but to control. After the feud, Hancock County saw an influx of religious missionaries funded by the same industrialists who profited from the region. Their message: submit to the new order, forget the old ways. Appalachian identity was painted as sinful, primitive, a curse to be cleansed. And so it was that entire communities abandoned their language, customs, even their names. Barnard Hollow was renamed on official maps, Troublesome Ridge omitted, and what was once a proud lineage of fighters became a whispered shame. This is psychological warfare carried out over generations. A war waged not with bullets, but with narratives, and the weapon, amnesia. Because if they can make you forget who you are, they never need to fire a shot. But something stirs in the bones of these mountains. Those who walk the ridges speak of strange sounds, at night voices, drums, a presence. They say the land remembers, and when enough men remember too, history begins to crack. You feel it now, a deep, ancient force moving beneath your skin. The knowledge that Sutton didn't die just for land, that the Barnard Boys weren't mere outlaws, but that all of it was part of a greater design to sever you from your origin, your strength, your will. This is not just about Appalachia. This is about you. Wherever you are, however far from those ridges, this war comes to your door. Will you remember, or will you forget and let them write the story for you? The choice is yours, but choose wisely, because history, once reclaimed, does not forgive silence. Silence, you see, is the final weapon, and it's been used with precision, not just to bury the Suttons, the Barnards, the hollow men, but to bury every man who ever stood against the machine. Think of it, the gravestones left unmarked, the deeds of land lost in mysterious fires, the bloodlines erased from public record. These are not accidents. They are tactics in a long, slow war against memory itself. And while the world changed, automobiles replaced horses, while radios replaced town criers, the method of control stayed the same. Feed the people a narrative, distract them with feuds and fear, and as they fight amongst themselves, steal their past, steal their future. This is what happened in Hancock County, and it is what happens everywhere. Power seeks to consume the soul of a people, but something went wrong for the elites. They underestimated the land. They underestimated the human spirit. Because though men can be killed, those stories can be suppressed. Truth leaves traces. It lingers in the soil, in the bloodlines, in the eyes of men who refuse to kneel. And in the hills of East Tennessee, that truth has never fully died. Every decade, it rises strange sightings, mysterious symbols etched into tree bark, warnings passed from grandfather to grandson. The hollow men may have been hunted, but their message wasn't erased. Never forget, never forgive, never surrender. Now, as modern eyes turn away from history, obsessed with entertainment and ease, the time has come to awaken what lies dormant. You watching this, you feel it, the pulse of ancient defiance. This story was never meant to entertain you. It was meant to arm you. Arm you with truth so powerful it cannot be undone. The kind of truth that shatters illusions, that strips away the lies built into your life since birth. You were never meant to be docile. You were never meant to obey. You come from men who walked alone into the wild with nothing but grit and a rifle and built a life no one could take, until they did. Now the question becomes, what will you do with this truth? Hide it or live it, because once you carry it, there is no going back, and that's exactly why they fear you. They fear you because knowledge is dangerous, but embodied knowledge is lethal. Once you know the truth and carry it in your blood, you become something they cannot predict, cannot manipulate, cannot own. And this is what they fought to destroy in Appalachian, just men, but mindsets. Hen Sutton wasn't just a killer. He was a man who refused to be controlled, who stood as a sovereign force in a world that demanded submission. Not merely outlaws, but men born into conflict, shaped by violence, not of their making, who chose war over surrender. And the hollow men, they weren't criminals. They were memory incarnate, living proof that power could be resisted without permission. But their memory, like so many others, was declared inconvenient. And so, piece by piece, the institutions arrived law, religion, milliged, drowned the truth in noise. And men who once ruled mountains became caricatures, stereotypes, jokes. You've seen it. How history becomes entertainment. How rebellion becomes folklore. Harmless, forgotten. But what if it's not? What if the same blood that ran in Sutton's veins runs in yours? What if the call of the ridge, the pull of the wild, the urge to never kneel, what if that's you? Then this story is not just a story, it's a summons. A call to reclaim what was stolen, not through bullets, through clarity, through remembrance, through the unshakable decision to live as a man who knows who he is on, cannot be moved. That is what they cannot tolerate. That is what keeps them awake at night. The thought that the silence they paid so much to maintain might shatter. And now, it is. You are the crack in their system. Every man who watches, who awakens, who remembers, is a fracture in their illusion. And when enough fractures form, the whole edifice collapses. The truth about Hancock County, about the Barnards, about Hen Sutton, is just one truth in a sea of suppressed stories. But it is yours now, a piece of forbidden history restored. And with it comes a question: will you carry it forward? Or will you let it die in silence? Speak, remember, refuse. This is how the war is won. Winning this war doesn't mean headlines or parades. It means becoming untouchable, mentally, spiritually, historically. The elites didn't just silence Sutton and the Barnards. They tried to annihilate the idea of men who couldn't be bought, broken, or branded. Think about it. The story ends not with trials or justice, but with the reappearance of the Barnards' rifles in hand, seeking the last blood of the Sutton line. And that church, the place meant for peace, became a battlefield. That's not just drama, that's symbolism. It shows you where the real fight happens, in the sacred places, in the spaces they tell you to be silent, obedient, afraid. The Barnards waited at every door, ready to end the Sutton legacy. But the young Sutton didn't wait. He struck first. That's the code: never wait, never ask, never beg. Act with clarity, precision, and purpose. And as the bullets flew, as the church became a tomb, two bloodlines ended: Big John and Sutton, locked together in death. But what didn't die was the spirit. Because what happened next shocked even the people of Hancock County. The mountain didn't go silent, it howled. Storms ravaged the land. Crops failed. And the people said the land was cursed because of the blood feud, because of the secrets buried in the soil. But what if it wasn't a curse? What if it was the land remembering, refusing to rest until the truth was spoken? That's the core of this mystery. The land itself became a witness. It couldn't speak in words, so it spoke in omens, fires, storms, whispers in the trees. And those who listened understood. They passed the story down, not in books, but in warnings. Stay away from troublesome ridge. Never speak the Sutton name at night. Do not dig in Barnard Hollow. These were not superstitions. They were defenses. Because even long after the guns fell silent, the war for memory raged on. And now it rages within you. You stand at the same crossroads as every man who ever dared to remember. Forget and be safe, or remember and become dangerous. Dangerous to lies, dangerous to silence, dangerous to those who tremble at the thought of free men. The war continues, and you are now a part of it. And in this war, the first casualty is always the man who hesitates. That's why they teach hesitation, breed passivity, reward silence. Look around, how many men today know their ancestors, their real history, their true name? Most can't trace their blood beyond a few generations. That's by design. Because when you know your roots, you become immovable. And immovable men are immune to manipulation. That's what the Barnards were. That's what Hen Sutton was. And that's what the Hollow Men vowed to remain. But for the powers that be Washington elites, northern industrialists, railroad baronsmen like that were a threat. They didn't want independence in the mountains. They wanted obedience. And where obedience couldn't be bought, it was taken by force. First came the bribes, then the bullets, then the stories. And in time, Hen Sutton was no longer a patriot, he was a villain. The Barnards weren't defenders, they were savages. Do you see the game? Control the narrative, and you control perception. Control perception, and you control reality. That's why you were never told this story in school. That's why history books mention battles, presidents, dates, but never the war for the soul of Hancock County. Because if you knew that the law could be bent, that governors could pardon murderers for political gain, that entire bloodlines could be erased from the record, you might start asking questions, dangerous questions, and then you'd see the pattern, how history repeats, how modern men are still being silenced, still being labeled, still being erased. You'd see that today's outlaws are simply those who refuse the lies, refuse the leash, refuse the silence. So they call them extremists, threats, enemies, just like they called the Hollow Men. And just like then, the goal is simple. Erase the memory, and the man forgets his power. But you haven't forgotten. Not anymore. This story is your weapon, a key to unlock what they buried deep inside. You the truth that you are not meant to obey. You are meant to stand. And when you stand, you resurrect not just the past, but the future. Their grip slips, the illusion cracks, and you become the reckoning they never saw coming. The reckoning begins with remembrance, but it ends with action. Not in the streets, not in the news, but within. The quiet, irreversible decision to never again allow yourself to be shaped by their hand. Because now you've seen what happens when men forget, when they trade their fire for comfort, when they let history be written by cowards and kings. They become spectators in their own legacy, soft, compliant. That is not your fate. The blood of men like Sutton and the Barnards does not vanish, it sleeps. And when a man remembers, it awakens. You feel it now, a heat beneath your skin, a surge in your chest. That's not just adrenaline, that's the ancient fire, the force that built kingdoms, crossed oceans, carved civilization from wilderness, and it's yours. They told you to fear it, to suppress it, to apologize for it, but that's because they fear you. A man who owns himself cannot be ruled, and that terrifies them. That's why they silenced the mountains, why they erased troublesome ridge, why they turned the story of the hollow men into dust. Because if you knew the truth, that real power isn't given, it's taken, you'd stop waiting, you'd stop obeying, and you'd start becoming the kind of man who doesn't flinch, who doesn't ask, who acts like Hen Sutton did, like the Barnards did, and like you now must. Understand this. The war for your mind has been raging since before you were born. Every movie, every lesson, every whisper of fear was a weapon aimed at your will. And yet you're still here, watching, listening, awakening. That means they failed. But now you must finish the fight. Choose, speak, stand. Because once you do, there's no going back. No comfort, no silence. Only power. The kind that bends the world to your will. The kind they cannot take. So ask yourself, what will they write about you? Will you be forgotten? Or will you become the storm that cracks their foundation forever? Decide now, because history waits for no man, and the mountain still remembers. The mountain remembers because it was never just land, was a living testament to freedom. A wild, untamed force that mirrored the men who lived upon it. Suttons Ridge, Barnard Hollow, Troublesome Ridge. These weren't just places. They were battlegrounds of will. They witnessed what the world has forgotten, that true law comes not from government, but from the soul of a man. That's why the state feared them. Not because they killed, but because they couldn't be controlled. Hen Sutton didn't wear a badge for justice. He wore it as a symbol, answer to no one. The Barnards didn't ride together for power. They rode for blood loyalty, the unbreakable bond that terrifies tyrants. And when Sutton's son fired that first shot in the church, he wasn't committing murder, he was reclaiming honor. This is what modern men have lost. Honor, loyalty, will. They've been taught to apologize for their strength, to doubt their instincts, to hand over their power in exchange for approval. But men like Sutton knew better. They took what was theirs, and in their taking, they forced the world to reckon with them. That's your inheritance. Not silence, not shame, fire. And now you stand at the same crossroads, the same ridgeline. One step forward, and you awaken the hollow man within. One step back, and you die in chains. This isn't metaphor, this is reality. Because as they flood the world with distractions, dependence, division, they tighten the grip. And the only way out is through remembrance. Through rebellion, not with violence, but with clarity. With a mind that cannot be fogged, a spine that cannot be bent, a soul that refuses to kneel. That's the legacy of Hancock County. Not bloodshed, defiance. The kind that echoes across generations, that whispers in the wind, that waits for the next man to rise. You are that man, and this is your moment. Let them fear you, let them feel you. Let them know the hollow men are not dead. They walk again, and this time they will not be silenced. Not by fear, not by force, not by anyone. Now you know the truth, and there's no returning to the sleep they crafted for you. You are marked not by fate, but by choice. The choice to see what others fear, to hear what others deny, to become what others cannot. This isn't just the end of a story, it's the ignition of something ancient inside you. You've walked through the smoke of Troublesome Ridge, stood where blood sanctified the soil, and heard the cries of forgotten men echo through hollowed hills. That's not fiction, that's revelation. The state thought it won, the church thought it controlled, the elite thought they erased the past. But all they did was delay the inevitable awakening of men who can feel the truth pounding in their chest like war drums. You are not meant for chains. You are not built for obedience. You are the remnant of a lineage that refused, and refusal is power. Power they can't calculate, legislate, or annihilate. That's why they rewrite history. That's why they bury names, burn records, and flood your mind with noise. Because a man who remembers is a man who resists. Hence Suttons ghost rides. Every road where men claim sovereignty, the Barnard blood still stains the earth as a warning and a promise. And now it's your blood, your name, your legacy that enters the fray. You've been initiated, not by ritual, but by truth. The kind of truth that makes you ungovernable, unbroken, and unbound. Carry it, speak it, live it, and never apologize. Because the time has come to reclaim the mountains, not just of earth, but of mind. And those who sit in high places, trembling behind curtains of power, will soon realize their time is done. The hollow men walk again not in shadows, but in the open eyes, sharp, backs straight, fire rising, and you, now awakened, are one of them. They will fear you, they should. This is how the story truly ends, not with sovereigns, but with sovereignty, not with surrender, but with dominion. And when they ask who lit the fire, you'll smile and sigh did, because now you know who you are, and you will never be ruled again. There is one final truth, one they never wanted you to hear. The Sutton-Barnard feud was never just a battle over hogs or land or pride. It was a war for control, not of a county, not even of Appalachia, but of memory, because memory is power. If they can erase your past, they erase your identity. And if you don't know who you are, you will believe anything they tell you. You'll wear their labels, live by their codes, die by their rules. That is why they erased the hollow men, not because of their violence, but because of their clarity. They knew who they were. They knew their land, their blood, their code, and that made them dangerous, because a man with clarity cannot be owned. That's what you are reclaiming now, not just a story, not just a legacy, but your clarity, your command. The mountain never truly belonged to the state. The law was never in control. The land belonged to those who dared live free. That's the secret they feared you'd uncover, that you don't need them. That power was never theirs to give, it was always yours to take. The Barnards walked free in the end, not because the governor had mercy, but because power recognizes power. Fear bows to those who fear nothing. The hollow men weren't anomalies. They were the default. And the world has spent over a century trying to convince you that your nature is weakness, compliance, subservience, but the blood in your veins tells a different story. It tells of fire, defiance, unbreakable will. And now, awakened, you are no longer a pawn. In their world you are the storm they failed to contain. The shadows of Hancock County are calling, not for fear, but for reckoning. And you are the answer, the final piece, the unbroken line of men who will never again bow, never again forget. The story ends here, but your transformation begins now. Comment below, I am the hollow man, twice to mark your awaking and to let the world know the mountains rise again. You are no longer asleep. You are no longer theirs. You are free, and they will never see it coming.